I'm happy to affirm the resolution that karma is a better way to moderate behavior than fear of the afterlife. So let's get into a quick definition of karma just so we know what we're talking about. Dictionary.com defines it as karma is being seen as bringing upon oneself inevitable results, good or bad, either in this life or in a reincarnation. Karma socially, of course, is the discussion that if you do something bad, something's going to happen back to you. For all of you guys after this debate, if you just go to YouTube and search funny karma compilations, it's a really good time. You'll see plenty of people who say like trip someone who's walking by maliciously and then they get hit by a bus or something relatively statistic, but it goes back to prove the point that if you do something bad will come back to you. That's the belief of karma. Now the weighing mechanism is obvious. You should use the weighing mechanism of harmful behavior. In other words, what we're saying is if you want to know which one's better at moderating behavior, look at the results. Look to see which kind of system will allow for more harmful behavior and which kinds will, say, prevent more harmful behavior. With that, I have two main contentions that are contrasting the idea that karma is better at preventing harm. The first is you can write down as a volatile idea. Now, I just want to preface both of these arguments with this idea. There's two things that have to happen for a system to moderate behavior. First, it must select the kind of behavior that it deems good. And the second thing is that it must be accurate in moderating that. And so that's what my two main arguments are going to fall on. The first one you can write down is volatility. Now, I think the big question we have to ask is the fear of which afterlife? Because there are many religious systems that pose an afterlife to where you not doing something terrible should make you afraid. For example, people that either hyper-religious fundamentalists, radical Islamic terrorists who blow themselves up running into a building, they are afraid of the afterlife if they don't do that. So when we say the fear of the afterlife is better, if my opponent's going to make that argument, he has to defend that the fear of the afterlife as a general rule is. And it clearly isn't, because it all depends on what your afterlife says is a good thing. Now, karma is very different because it's not as volatile, because it's tied to a basic rule of whether or not you're harming someone or helping someone. It's way more likely to predict, pro-social behavior, actions and behavior that's beneficial towards society as opposed to destructive, just as a concept. Fear of the afterlife imposed from some sort of religion, because religions are so diverse, we don't know what kind of behavior they're even asking us to be afraid of not doing, which is what makes it dangerous. Let's get down to the second argument you can write down as personal incentives. Now, this argument says that karma is more likely to moderate behavior well because the actual method that it moderates behavior is more accurate. Karma says that the results are inevitable, that they will fall back on you, whereas many religious systems that posit a fear of the afterlife offer some way for you to get out. For example, you could actually commit a genocide, and according to some adherents to the Christian faith, you could apologize at the end, repent of your sins, and immediately go to heaven and live in bliss. So there's ways to escape personal responsibility with the fear of the afterlife, but karma says that it's inevitable. It has to happen to you. As a result, people have a personal incentive to not do bad because they know it's going to come back.
All right. So first of all, I just want to say that I am not quite as organized as you are, but I will attempt to respond to some of your points. I am saying that I am Khan saying that the fear of the is a more governing morality premise than karma. First, I'd like to define moral order, which according to IASC, moral order is a dimension of culture. Generally, the term refers to any system of obligations that defines and organizes the proper, good, right, virtuous relations among individuals and groups in a community. Secondly, I'd like to quote Buddha. Buddha is obviously the deity in Buddhism from which karma stems. According to this view, this is his take on inequalities of people throughout their lives and in a societal systems. According to this view, owing to previous action, men will become murderers, thieves, unchaste, liars, slanderers, covetous, malicious, and perverts. Thus, for those who fall back on the former deeds as the essential reason, there is neither the desire to do, nor the effort to do, nor necessity to do this deed, or abstain from this deed. That's from buddhanet.net, to which they expound, according to Buddhism, this inequality is due not only to heredity, environment, nature, nurture, but also to karma. In other words, it is the result of our own past actions and present doings. We ourselves are responsible for our own happiness and misery. We create our own heaven. We create our own hell. We are the architects of our fate. I will say that in essence, the self-government of karma does not create a moral order for people to follow and for societies to build a class system to which people understand what is good, positive behavior and what is not. Just touching on one point that my opponent made as far as behavior selection being volatile and people who respond to their extreme views and bomb places because they believe that that is what is going to take them to the afterlife. I would contend that that action is being governed by their fear of the afterlife, and that it may not be the most productive action, but the fear of the afterlife is what causes them to take such drastic measures.
So just to confirm, drastic measures such as suicide bomb are bad, right?
Yes.
And you believe that they're inspired by a fear of the afterlife?
Yes, I think that radical measures such as suicide bombing are not productive to society. However, they are governing the behavior of those involved into doing that for fear of the afterlife.
So do you oppose the resolution? I'm confused because the resolution says karma is a better way to moderate behavior, and you just told me that suicide bombing is bad. And then you also said that that's because... Are you actually saying that the fear of the afterlife is a better way to moderate behavior? If so, I'm not really...
I'm saying that fear of the afterlife is a better way to moderate behavior because fear of the afterlife causes people to do things that are more in line with their morals and with their the societal institution through their religion of what is right and wrong. I'm saying that karma is a completely self-governing system, whereas it doesn't create any moral order based on the religious premise. I'm not saying that it's positive to do suicide bombings, but I'm saying it's an effective way to create their behavior and thus moderate that behavior into doing what they believe is correct.
So how is self-governance worse than suicide bombing?
That's not exactly an equivalent, but self-governance allows you to justify any action based on, you know, what your own personal moral ground is, rather than the established societal moral acceptance.
If you knew that walking outside right now would result in a meteor crushing you to the ground, would you do it?
If I wanted to be crushed by a meteor, I would probably do it.
Do you think most people want to be crushed by meteors?
Well, most people are not the debaters. I mean, you're using a logical fallacy here saying that most people would not do that. However, if you want to take it that way, most people, I think it's, according to statistics, it's 79.6% of people are not Buddhist and are not non-denominational or not secular, non-religious. So most people are governing their actions based on their fear of the afterlife.
All right, I'm going to work back and respond from a couple of the arguments my opponents made. The first thing I want to say is that just his case at face value doesn't really have an impact. He gives kind of good analysis and some quotations from, Buddhist religious ideology, but he doesn't really end with negating the resolution. He says self-governance is bad, but at the moment he tells everyone watching this that yes, fear of the afterlife can inspire suicide bombing, terrorism, and, you know, in another sense, we could even say genocide. How on earth is karma ever worse than that? I mean, he can hypothesize and say, well, you know, maybe someone who's self-governing might do something bad someday, but we've already seen examples throughout history of people that were motivated afterlife. Bomb 9/11 were doing so primarily because they believed they would go immediately to heaven afterward. Look to examples in history throughout the Crusades. It's the fear of the afterlife, of if we don't please God with all of this bloodthirst, then what else are we going to do? The fear of the afterlife has numbers stacked against it. My opponent can hypothesize that karma might be bad, but at the end of the day, he's not even given you an argument explaining how it is. He's just said maybe. which isn't even an argument. It's just a suggestion that you might want to vote neg. I'd ask you just to look at the evidence available to you and the arguments as we've had. The second thing I want you to remember is that self-governance is a term. So my opponent uses the word self-governance almost in an ugly way to say that being self-governing is bad. First, he's never going to use this to outweigh something like suicide bombing or terrorism. That's never possibly going to be a worse thing. Unless he gives you some examples, there's not really an argument to be had. The second response is that self-governance is helpful. Think about the basic, I hate to make generic appeals to capitalism here, but it works, so just roll with me. If someone wants to build a business so that they can be successful, they have personal incentives to do good for society. They don't want to make a product that's bad, that everyone will hate and that will run them out of business. So they want to ensure that they're good to everyone else around them. The same thing is true of self-governance and the idea of karma. It's the idea that the consequences of your actions are inevitable. People act in their self-interest. So of course, they're never going to do something that's violent towards another person, or they're less likely to because they know it's going to fall directly on their head. So I think my opponent's case hasn't done much to negate the resolution. I just want to pull you back to the two main arguments of volatility, as well as the, why is someone calling me in the middle of a debate run? It's so stupid. As well as the idea of the outcomes. So first, we've analyzed the ends of the afterlife vary depending on your religion. That's incredibly dangerous. My opponent, might be a Christian. He might not be a Christian. Regardless of the religion he supports, there is a fear of another form of afterlife that's going to create negative impacts, and it's going to be dangerous. And the second argument was about methodology. Look, at the point that a fear of the afterlife allows you to do terrible things, but even so, even within the confines of its own religion, can allow you to do things that violate that religion and then apologize at the end to get in for free, that allow you to avoid all personal responsibility just with a simple statement to the Most High, that isn't a responsible system, and it doesn't confer good behavior.
Okay, just to respond to my opponent, I don't believe we're talking about whether behavior is good or bad. That is an entirely different subject. What we're talking about is the moderation of behavior. And I would say that structured religion and the fear of the afterlife causes people to moderate their behavior more and curtail it towards the system to which they prescribe. I do not advocate for one religion over another. I just simply say that the fear of the afterlife is a more effective moderator of behavior, as people who prescribe to those ideologies tend to follow them more closely than one who can create their own system of moral good and moral order. Also, I would like to just point out that karma, according to Buddha, makes any action justifiable. The person is self-regulating, again, so they can decide what is good for them and what is bad for them, what is helpful to their prerogative and what is not, and justify their heaven or their hell based on their own personal digestion of information. I will turn it over to you.
First thing is, I want to respond to the Buddha thing because I feel like this is getting misrepresented. Buddha is not saying that self-regulation equals anything you do must be good. Notice the actual rhetoric that my opponent quotes, where he says that you're responsible for creating your own heaven/hell, or that you are the architects of your fate. Buddha isn't saying you're self-regulating, so anything you do must be okay. He's saying you're self-regulating. If you choose to violate basic regulations, they will come back upon you. If you choose to do evil for other people, that will fall back on your own head. Buddha never for a second says that your behavior doesn't matter. I mean, that would run amok to the entire thesis of Buddhism as it. So this is a straw man. It's not really representing what he's saying. Buddha is saying that you are wholly responsible for the life you live. You are wholly responsible for the quality of your existence. As such, the obvious implication would be don't do bad stuff because it will come back upon you. The last thing is that my opponent seems to be missing the point of this debate. He says, well, we're not talking about the quality of behavior here. We're not actually talking about what results in better behavior. We're just talking about moderation. So the two responses are this. First, come back to the Wang mechanism. I explicitly opened this debate round by talking about harmful behavior as the Wang mechanism, meaning that we should measure which is better at moderation, remember that word better, by which results in more harmful behavior. So if one side consistently produces and consistently allows for, by the system of its ideas, more harmful behavior to people, that isn't moderating behavior very well. It's letting terrible stuff slip through the cracks and occur. That's just a bad thing. Whereas another system that, say, prevents harmful behavior, encourages people to be responsible, take care of society, not be a serial killer, that kind of stuff is a better way to moderate behavior. So the first thing is just at face value, he's not really responded to the weighing mechanism, so there isn't a counter argument to leverage or vote for. The second thing is that moderation has quality. The resolution uses the word better. It doesn't just ask which moderates. I mean, I really don't understand how that would be a debatable discussion. Both moderate behavior. Both say, hey, there's this afterlife, do this thing or don't do this thing. And karma says, hey, there's your life, you're going to have these outcomes, do this thing or don't. Both obviously moderate. The question isn't, do they moderate? It's which one does it better. So observe the quality of moderation through the outcomes of people's behavior. Is it more harmful? Is it less harmful? And then you vote based on off that. I think too, all the other arguments that I made about how the afterlife is an extremely volatile concept that can dangle any carrot in front of the ox in the field. They can say suicide bombing is your carrot, do it or you won't get the afterlife. The exact inverse of that. I mean, take like something like the Amish belief system that would describe nonviolence and pacifism. There's so much volatility in the idea of the afterlife that it is a dangerous idea. And the second thing is that just methodologically, because the afterlife gives you ways to avoid your responsibility, such as by Christian repentance or what have you, it isn't effective. It is one of the least effective ways to moderate behavior because it produces bad outcomes in an inaccurate and inefficient way.
So I would contend that my opponent is misinterpreting the adjective in the posed question, is a better way to moderate. It's not saying, does it create better behavior? It's saying, is it a better way to moderate? Is it a more effective way? Better being increased effectiveness. And to that, I would say I have argued most every point that you've said. I would also like to say that my opponent seems to think that I'm completely ignoring the concept of good behavior and bad behavior. I understand the concept of good behavior and bad behavior. However, I think that different societal constructs that create the fear of the afterlife dictate what behavior is acceptable and what behavior is appreciated within that construct. The notion that created religion and the fear of the afterlife is not as effective as karma in curtailing these bad behaviors is somewhat true. However, I would say that the fear of the afterlife is not something that one can just justify whatever action they take based on their personal belief. They have to do it within the guise of the societal construct that creates what is and is not moral order. If one religion says that something is okay and another religion says that it's not okay, that creates an effective way to moderate the behavior of those who are prescribed to it, as opposed to just every individual within the society prescribing to their own moral values and their own set of morality and being able to create their own heaven or their own hell so that they can live within that construct for themselves.
Okay, are there afterlives that you don't believe in? If there are, can you give me an example?
No.
So you believe in all afterlives ever, that were ever made by any religion?
There is not a single afterlife that I can objectively say does not exist.
Oh, okay, fair. So you reject all of them. So you'd find it pretty horrifying then. I mean, I'm assuming, I'll let you answer. Do you reject the concept of the afterlife? That's what it sounded like.
Do not accept nor reject because I do not have any scientific or objective proof that there is or is not an afterlife, and thus I can't respond to your questions in a way that's not going to come off as me responding improperly.
That's all that I need to know. My question is, given your agnosticism on the issue of an afterlife, which I think is reasonable, would you be horrified? Wouldn't it be terrifying for someone to run into a building, bomb strapped to their chest, say, now I get to be with God? Concept to you?
A horrifying concept to most everyone. That's why it's labeled as terrorism. It's creating terror, fear. Thus, there you go.
you think of any violent action that could be motivated by karma? Can you just like, even if you don't know of an example in the past, could you think of how that could happen?
If one is able to govern their own morality, then they could justify that they're doing these things in a light that is positive to themselves, and thus they're fine in doing these things if it creates their own happiness.
Okay. Let's first just address that. This is just a misconstruing of what karma is. Karma is not the idea that just you make up your own rules. We wouldn't need the religion of Buddhism to do that. People already do that if they're not religious. They make up their own standards about what's right and wrong. I mean, I'm sorry, this is just such a gross misunderstanding of what Buddhism is. It's not just saying make up and do whatever you want and find a way to justify it at the end of the day. It's saying that there are inevitable consequences for your outcomes. I mean, the definition that I read, there's multiple definitions. I'll read you another one outside of the one that I read, that the consequences are inevitable, good or bad, either in this life or in a reincarnation. It also describes the cosmic principle according to which each person is rewarded or punished in one incarnation according to that person's deeds in a previous incarnation. This is what's critical. According to that person's deeds means that regardless of what you feel about what you do, if you do something bad, the consequences for it will be inevitable. That you take responsibility for the stuff you do. My opponent is strawmanning Buddhism by saying that Buddhism is just the idea you make up as you go and justify whatever you want. That's not that's not even a religious belief. That's not a claim to karma, and it's certainly not a claim to Buddhism. So I think we should be careful. When Buddha says something like self-governance, he's saying that yes, you are allowed to decide how you act, but you will pay the consequences for that. That you are the architect of your fate doesn't mean that fate will be the say contradiction of your actions. By stealing, you'll end up getting richer. He's saying that if you do good things, then there will be these positive outcomes for you, and vice versa. If you do bad things, then bad things will happen to you. I mean, everyone knows what karma is. Like before you entered this topic, you did not even need to look up the definition. You know that karma is the idea that you do bad stuff comes back to you. So I don't think we should pretend that karma means something radically different. It's moral subjectivism, because that's not even a religious position. It's not a Buddhist position, and it has nothing to do with this debate. So with that idea out of the way, let's step back to the only other issue that my opponent's leveraging. So what he's saying is that the resolution is in no way talking about quality at all. He's saying, well, you know, the resolution is just saying it moderates it more. So before I continue this argument, I just want to ask my opponent a question. Would you believe that it's better to raise kids in an abusive household or in a loving household?
Just to respond to one thing that my opponent has said, and that is that karma is, I think you said karma is subjective moralism. And that is part of my argument, is that it's entirely subjective. When you have a social construct that creates laws and rules and you know, a moral framework for their subscribers, then you're taking some of the subjectivism out of the morality. It's creating objective morality and a system of beliefs that these people prescribe to. Now, I'm not saying that throughout history, one has been more positive than another one. However, I am saying that it's more effective to create a framework of morality for your believers to follow. And most religions, radical extremism where bombing occurs is not the only, it's not the only existence of actions that follow a religious framework. Religious frameworks are generally instituted to create moral order and have people say, okay, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, things like that. They are universally accepted moral principles. As far as raising a child in an abusive household or a loving household, I don't exactly see the relevance.
Do you have an opinion on whether or not it's better to grow up abused or not?
That's such a leading question. I can't possibly answer it. I mean, come on.
It's such an obvious question that anyone should be able to answer it. The idea is simple. If you say it's better to grow up or live in a certain environment instead of the other, you're not saying it's better because I live more. You're saying because the quality of life is better, that it is superior. and I know we're getting basic and grammatical here, but the resolution says that karma is a better way to moderate behavior. It seems what my opponent has said is, well, quantitatively there is more moderation, whatever that means. I have no idea how that could possibly apply or even work, but there's technically more moderation, so it must be better. In other words, ignore the quality of the moderation, ignore whether or not it's actually accurate, like whether or not it allows you to cop out at the end and avoid personal responsibility, avoid all outcomes too of how we moderate behavior. Like if the behavior is the worst thing we could imagine, child torture, genital mutilation, another thing that fear of the afterlife promotes, genocide, terrorism, like all this stuff, he's basically saying, oh, no, like don't even worry about that, because we're not talking about what the behavior is. We're just talking about what moderates more. Again, this is not a reasonable argument. I would suggest that just on the grammar of when we say something is a better way to moderate behavior, we're talking about if the behavior gets better, is it doing more good? Is it more effective? So collapsing down to this, I don't think there are arguments currently that can persuade you to vote negative. But what I would ask you to look back to is the basic issue of volatility and accuracy. The first thing we have to ask is, which afterlife? My opponent seems to not support or positively believe in any afterlife, yet he's trying to tell you that being deathly afraid of it is an effective way to govern society. The second thing I want you to remember is that karma implies personal incentive. He says that karma is subjective. Well, so are all incentives. The capitalist's incentive to promote self-interest and protect yourself is good for society, but it's still subjective. I mean, that's the whole point, that when you are subjectively concerned with your well-being, you are going to be nicer to others because there's not a way for you to escape your outcomes. And the third and the final thing I want you to remember is the basic idea of accuracy. The afterlife gives you ways to get out of your outcomes, but karma forces you to be responsible. And I'd argue that this is just purely a more effective way to govern society.
Okay, so my contention is not that I do or don't believe in any particular afterlife. I'm trying to remain objective in considering all and any afterlives. That is not, you're misrepresenting what I'm saying as far as I do and don't believe in every single afterlife. As far as the concept of volatility, again, the creation of a moral framework within a religion or within a social construct that has believers that consider that there may be consequences in the afterlife or rewards for good behavior are all created in your actions upon this earth. They're all meant to make you behave better on this earth. That doesn't if you abuse a child, that is not productive, better behavior. That is just the creation of more anger. So your examples of extremism and of abusive behavior, none of those are generally acceptable behavior based on most moral principles of most religions in the world. I will also contend that if karma is a subjective morality, I am not saying that karma is not, institutionally accepted as right behavior and wrong behavior, consequences justifying actions. But it is up to a single individual to decide whether the consequences of their actions are morally acceptable for them to undertake in their proceeding of their actions. However, the construct of a framework of morality within religion is more effective and thus a better way of moderating the behavior of all of its subscribers or all of its believers, as opposed to creating just an individual subjective level that one decides, okay, this consequence is worth what I'm going to do for it. I just don't think that there is enough evidence as to how throughout history people have been punished for their personal subjective morality, as opposed to when violations of a thematic moral framework have been violated. I still have 52 seconds and I have no idea what I'm going to do with them. Can I pass it back?